Hello everyone, I'm Professor McCoy, and today I'm doing something of a response video to Jonathan Pageau's recent talk on Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy. Strange topic, really interesting topic, and one thing before I really get going, I wanted to mention, I just want to make pretty clear, a lot of times a response video is, a correction, a polemic, saying the other person's wrong, what have you. That's not my intention at all. Right? So when I'm here, I really want to provide maybe some more details. I want to expand on what Jonathan said in a charitable way. Right? I don't want to say that he's wrong because actually I think he's quite right. But I think that the topic could use some deeper analysis. So on that topic, if you're not familiar with him, Jonathan Pageau is an Eastern Orthodox icon carver who does some phenomenal analysis of symbology, including in this case, where he analyzes how exactly Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy exist, and given that he's in the sort of Eastern Christian tradition, and I am in the Western tradition, being a Catholic, I think that we have these styles that can complement one another. Right? So the East is known for mysticism and for large, broad ideas, but can be a bit vague. We in the West can be a bit hard-nosed, but we have a spiritual tradition of philosophical precision and deep analysis. So what I mean to do here is apply those Western tools to Jonathan's Eastern ideas. So I hope we're working together here in a sense. So to that end, I want to discuss this idea of how exactly these mythological or even one might say fictional things like Santa Claus exist. So, best way to approach this is to look at Plato's description of the ways that different things can exist. Now, I've discussed this in greater detail in a class lecture, so if you'd like to see that, I'll have a link to it in the description as well. That'll give some more examples and a more detailed description with some more detailed imagery. I have a board to write on, that sort of thing. So if you're looking more for the precise philosophical discussion of the topic more broadly, go ahead and check that out. I encourage you to do so. But in case you aren't familiar with the topic, and in case you don't have the extra couple hours to watch me lecture, I'll go over briefly what Plato has to say on the subject here. So Plato divides the kinds of things that exist into a few categories and aligns them in a sort of scale or chain of being, or chain of ontology. Overall, things can be either sensible or intelligible. So the sensible things are things that we can interact with and things that we can understand with our ordinary five senses. The intelligible things are things that we can only conceptualize, things that we can only understand or grasp with our minds. Right? And it's this abstraction, this intellectual cognition that makes us uniquely rational. Us human beings is uniquely rational. So at the lowest level of this, we have the sensible. And the sensible he divides further between ordinary, everyday objects, right, or particular real objects, which he says are the objects of what he calls belief or pistis. Those are things like me, myself as a human being, things like my tablet, things like my cat. Right? All of these are, particular objects that we can point to, that we can make observations about, things that we can form beliefs about, which is how Plato puts it. At a level lower than that, we have what he calls images, which are imitations of real particular objects. So this might be a picture of a cat, or this might be a story we tell about something. So if I tell you about what my daughter did yesterday, and I describe it well enough, you're hearing this about something real. But the description, the image in your head about what my little infant daughter did yesterday, that isn't real in as full a sense, or in the same sense as she is, or as I am, or as you are. Right? We're all real things, real objects. We do real things. We experience real events. Stories about them are, in this sense, an image. And this is objects of imagination, or eikasia. So also to note, since I'm here responding to an Eastern Orthodox thinker, of course, if any of you who are in the more Greek traditions have any corrections in terms of my pronunciation here, Jonathan especially, as I know I've attempted to correct his pronunciation. If that's the case, again, feel free. I may well be butchering the ancient Greek terminology, so my apologies for that. But these objects of imagination are what we would call imaginary. They're not real in the ordinary sense of the term real, like a real particular thing. Right? But they still exist, right? So the story about what happened yesterday it really exists. Right? The picture of the cat is a real picture. It exists. Right? What it depicts is a real object. Right? So it says something true. So these imaginary things can also be combinations of real things. So the ideal example of this is, say, a unicorn. So a unicorn, we can look at it a couple of ways. We can say that a unicorn is sort of a combination of a couple of real things. It's a combination of a horse and a horned creature, a creature with a horn. Right? So we can kind of think of these images as kind of real objects superimposed on one another in a way that we can look at them. Right? Look at them and see how they fit together into a single imaginary thing. Or, if we take sort of the origin story of unicorns, we can say that it's a description of a rhinoceros, which, right, is a real animal. Right? A rhinoceros is a real particular creature, but that when described in vague ways, right, so if you describe it as like a big horse with a horn on its face, that might come off sounding like a unicorn. Right? Or if you describe that to somebody, if I describe to you a large horse with a horn on its face, you may well imagine a unicorn. So it's not a real thing. It's sort of like an imperfect reflection of a real thing, but it still exists. It's still something that we can describe. We can say true or false things about it. Right? We can say that unicorns really do have one horn. Right? A unicorn that has two horns is not a unicorn. The only way that can be true is if they exist in at least some sense. In this case, in an imaginary sense. They exist as images. Exist as just images, imaginary things that we can talk about, that we can think of. Okay. All of these things are sensible. These are things that we grasp with our ordinary five senses. Above this, in a way more real than this, is what Plato calls the intelligible. The intelligible includes the forms, which are abstract concepts or ideas. Things like justice, things like humanity, things like goodness, beauty. Right? So these are, they're abstracted away from any particular object. Right? Just like the idea of the form of, say, a chair is different from this chair. Right? We can talk about what are chairs like in the abstract. And that's different from saying, what is this chair like? Right? So if I were to say, what's this chair like? And I were to say, it's made of wood with green and tan fabric. That'd be right? Because I'm talking about a particular thing. I'm talking about something sensible. But if I were to talk about chairs in general, and I were to say, chairs are wood, they're made of wood with tan and green fabric, I'd be very, very wrong. right? Because there are plenty of other kinds of chairs. There are chairs that are entirely made of metal. There are chairs that are much bigger, much smaller. They may or may not have arms, but they all embody this idea, this abstract form. Now, above this, right, at the point of the line, so to speak, is the good. Right? Plato calls the form of the good, which is ultimate unconditioned being or reality itself. Its goodness, its truth, its beauty. This is what the scholastic tradition picks up as God. Right? So God is identified with goodness itself, with being itself. Right? And it's the forms that imitate or reflect goodness in particular ways. Right? So justice is goodness in terms of interaction or in terms of social interaction. Chairs are goodness in terms of what they're for, right? So sitting, so they're for seating, they're good seating. Right? Humanity reflects goodness in its rationality, in humanity's rationality. Right? So it imitates what's above it. So now there's another section of this line, though, that is a bit more complex, a bit more difficult to describe. Plato refers to it as thought, or dianoia. And this is the existence of relations and mathematics. So this is the relation between things that do the things exist in either a particular way or as forms, but the relations between them exist as well, right? So we can conceptualize these things, right? We can think of relations between particular things. This is, for example, a good example of relations between particular things that we see as perfectly real are collections of things. So a city or a town or a family or a nation are all collections of individual people. This is what Aristotle will refer to as secondary substances. So they're not substances in the primary sense, substances as in particular things, but they're still real, and they can still be described in a sense, even if it's a more abstract sense. Right? So you can still, as Jonathan rightly points out, you can describe something like the spirit of a city. Right? That a city is a certain way, and that's true regardless of whether there are particular people in it or not. And so, if like when I moved from my hometown in Dunedin to Tampa for college years ago, my hometown didn't substantially change. Right? It was just a relation between different people, but it's still the same town. Right? Similarly, when I did move to Tampa, it's not like it became different because there were different people living there. Right? It's still Tampa. I just become part of that. Right? And I still have my own independent existence. But Tampa, this city, exists as a relation between the people who live there. So, of all these things, what do we make of things like Santa Claus? Things like the Tooth Fairy? Well, I would argue that these are myths. They're collective myths. They're ideas that we all share, and everyone who knows about Santa Claus. So what is it? What is this? Where does this fit on Plato's sort of chain of being? Well, we may initially think that it fits at the bottom, right, as images, as imaginary, right? And it's perfectly common to refer to Santa Claus as being imaginary, right? And that's reasonable, right? It seems reasonable. It's the kind of thing that you could make up. Just like a character in a story, this is something that you can imagine. You can take real aspects of real particular things, shift them around a little bit, and describe it in a new way, and that makes this new image, this new imaginary thing. But I don't think that's quite right. Because there's an important sense, and I think Jonathan rightly points this out as well, that Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy transcend individuals in a way that stories or characters in stories don't. And they transcend individual people because these myths are relations. But they're a particular kind of relation. They're relations between forms, or between concepts, or between, maybe we should say, between perfections. So Santa Claus, maybe to speak kind of broadly and maybe imprecisely, would be something like a relation between the forms of Christmas time, of happiness, of benevolence, of charity, and of good-spiritedness. Maybe something like that. Right? So it's this combination of these abstract concepts into a singular myth that embodies each of them, but it embodies the combination of them. Right? So it's not like Santa Claus is a perfect embodiment of good-spiritedness. It's not like Santa Claus is a perfect embodiment of charity, clearly. But Santa Claus is the relation between these ideals. Right? And this is what a good myth is. It shows how these various forms can interact. This is something like you see as Plato puts forward in his good ideas of how myths should be. So in the Republic, he has a lot to say about how the Homeric myths, the old epic poems, were flawed in that they were mere imitations of objects. They were only imaginary. They weren't these relations. They didn't relate to the forms in the proper way. They only existed on this very low-level way. So in a sense, the proper myth, a good myth, should embody relations between forms. And in this way, it's really similar to something like archetypes, Jungian or archetypes or something like that, right? Which embodies a combination of the intersection between various different ideals. So the hero is the intersection of the ideal of courage, of manliness, and of devotion to one's fellows, or something like that. Again, imprecise, but you get the idea. Whereas a particular hero, right, a story that involves a hero, imitates real objects, not so much imitating perfections. So to use an example here, and this is an example I've used before as well. And again, if you went back and you saw my earlier lecture about this topic, I spoke briefly about this there. And this is how we have different ideals, or we have a different taste in hero today than at least Plato would say we ought to. That's embodied in the distinction between, for example, Batman and Superman. So Superman is this myth in the proper sense. Superman is a relation between ideals. Superman is often criticized as not having an individual personality. It's often criticized as being boring, as not being relatable. Well, of course, right? Of course not. Superman is this ideal, is an idealized hero. He is the relation between all these heroic perfections, right? Of power, of benevolence, of kindness, of truth, of justice, we can add the American way, but we might have to come back to that in terms of looking at nations and what kind of thing they are, right? What kind of relation they are, but we'll come back there. But we can take this by contrast and look at Batman, right? So Batman is the everyman turned superhero, right? So he is an imitation of, he's just like a real person. In other words, he's just like an object that we can believe things about. So something sensible, but is an imitation of that sensible thing. So he's like a real particular person. What that means is Batman exists on the level of imaginary, or on the level of imagination. Superman exists on the level of relation, on the level of myth, of embodied perfections. And this is the difference. Because we may have this idea of, the flawed hero that's relatable and like a real person. Okay, maybe that is more relatable, but it's imperfect. It's not something to aspire to, right? You shouldn't want to aspire to be Batman. You shouldn't want to aspire to be a rich orphan with a strange bat fetish. You should aspire to be the hero, the Superman, right? The one who fights for the weak, etc. Okay, but what about this? What about groups? What about cities, nations, families, etc.? Jonathan seems to put these on roughly the same level as something like Santa Claus or the Tooth Fairy. And in a sense, he has a point, right? So each of these can be embodied by particular people. People can act on behalf of these, right? So the guy at the mall with the fake beard is acting as Santa Claus, right? So when the kid tells him what she wants for Christmas, right? She's not telling the guy at the mall, she's telling Santa Claus. Right? Perfectly reasonable. Similarly, the group, the city, can be embodied, or maybe the nation can be embodied by someone acting on behalf of the group, right? Either an elected official, maybe, or however we parse out representation. We can also describe Santa Claus in certain ways that don't have anything to do with any particular member, any particular person acting as Santa Claus, right? Just like we can describe a city in certain ways that don't describe particular aspects or particular personality traits of people. So we call, Philadelphia as the city of brotherly love. That's something about the city, right? It's something about the spirit of the city. We're describing the city, not so much necessarily the particular people in it that happen to be in it now. Just like we can describe Santa Claus as jolly, even if a particular mall Santa isn't having a great day, right? So they do have these parallels, sure. And they do seem to both exist on the level of relations. But the difference, I think, is that they are relations between fundamentally different kinds of things. So a city or a nation is a relation between particular individuals, right? Particular people. So this is a relation which reflects or transcends particular objects. Whereas a myth is a relation that connects various forms. So the myth is, in a sense, more real, more true than a city. And it's because it reflects something more real. It's a combination of more real things. It is a description of how these forms will fit together, rather than a description of how these particular objects will interact together. So it's the myth that is more real, more transcendent than even the city. Okay. So all this talk of cities and nations and whatnot transcending individuals may be a bit concerning to someone with a more individualist streak. Now, again, being of the Western tradition, I'm naturally more concerned with those things, in addition to my own philosophical commitments. And we can see this this sort of this tendency towards a sort of anti-individualism or collectivism in Plato, right, who considers the polis, the city, as more important and philosophic or ontologically higher than individual persons. But if we move forward through the Christian tradition, we can see a concept that sort of corrects for this, that brings those individual persons up above these relations, and even, one could argue, above forms. And that's the concept of theosis. Theosis, literally speaking, is to become divine, or to become like God. And this is the idea that by taking Christ into ourselves, we cease to be our own limited and flawed individual selves, and we become perfected. We take on the full image and likeness of God, and we shed away any flaws or sins we have. Right? This is the process of this is more than I need to go into here. This involves sanctification, purgatory, in the Catholic tradition, etc. And the point of this is that by this individual, this particular person, becoming perfected by internalizing God into oneself, we can then transcend our finitude, our particularity, our limitations, and we can become perfect versions of ourselves. And this is different from saying we become perfection itself or being itself, right? Because that would be truly becoming God, and that can't be. That would mean that we're either just uniting ourselves to God and therefore ceasing to exist, or if we're becoming, multiple instances of being itself, which is incoherent. Rather, we are internalizing this perfection, right? This divine perfection, so that we transcend ourselves. We transcend our own particularities and imperfections. This then brings us up to be above these relations of city or nation or even myth. And this is, I think, in part why hagiographies replaced mythologies, why stories of saints replaced stories of heroes. Because we have something that's more real, even, than a transcendent myth. So I hope looking at this has, like I mentioned at the beginning, I hope this has been a sort of joint effort in coming to understand these issues, these maybe even surprisingly complex and interesting issues. And again, I hope this is not taken as any kind of a rebuke or anything. I entirely mean this to be a charitable expansion and addition to Jonathan Pageau's description of how Santa Claus, the Tooth Fairy, cities, and such, how these things exist. And again, applying this Western philosophical precision to these broad, grand Eastern ideas. So with that, thank you for listening, and I will see you next time.